We're going to go ahead and get started now. Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the official launch of the report Connecting the Dots, Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights as Prerequisites for Global Gender Equality and Empowerment from the Population Institute. Today's event is hosted by the Wilson Center's Maternal Health Initiative and Environmental Change and Security Program in partnership with the Population Institute. I'm Deekshitha Ramanarayanan, Program Associate for the Maternal Health Initiative. The Wilson Center is a critical source of nonpartisan foreign policy research and analyses, where we work to tackle global issues through independent research, open and honest dialogues, such as the one we're holding today, and actionable ideas. The Maternal Health Initiative covers a wide range of issues related to global health and gender, and we look to focus on the intersections between foreign policy, gender equity, and global health, particularly maternal, newborn, sexual, and reproductive health. And the Environmental Change and Security Program looks at the intersections of climate, health, and security. Thank you very much to the Population Institute for your generous support in making this event happen today. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the Maternal Health Initiative and Environmental Change and Security Program for your hard work in putting together today's event. Globally, commitment to improving women and girls' health, ensuring freedom from violence, and promoting equal participation in education, the workforce, and politics is critical to achieving our gender equality and empowerment goals. However, achieving these goals involves actively investing in comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services and recognizing the interconnectedness of these services across security and development sectors. Today, we will hear from two of the authors of the Connecting the Dots reports, who will share the report's findings and recommendations. We will also hear from our expert speakers on the importance of increased financial and political support for sexual and reproductive health and rights to improve the health, well-being, education, political and community engagement, and safety and security of the world's women and girls. For those of you watching online, if you have questions for our panel, please put your questions into the chat box directly below the live video on the event webpage, and we will pass your questions to our moderator, who will present them to the panel. For those of you in the room, we will have a few microphones in the room so that you may ask your questions directly to our panelists today. We'll save the last 20 minutes of the event for our audience Q&A, so please hold your questions until then. You can follow the conversation through our Twitter at Wilson_MHI with the hashtag Connecting the Dots to SRHR or MH Dialogue. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for today's event, Sarah Craven. Sarah Craven is the director of the North American Representation Office of UNFPA, where she works with American leaders on supporting essential sexual and reproductive health. We at the Maternal Health Initiative are proud of our longtime partnership with Sarah and UNFPA and are thrilled to welcome Sarah to speak today. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is very exciting to be here after the pandemic, right? Our first time back in person. So thank you so much for that. I'm a little choked up by that kind introduction. The Wilson Center is such an important convener and nexus for thought and new approaches to policy and research on women and girls, and I'm just really, really honored to be here today. I'm especially appreciative of the Wilson Center's leadership in lifting up sexual and reproductive health and rights to the policy agenda. I want to thank Sarah Barnes and Deekshitha, the Maternal Health Initiative and the Environmental Change and Security Program for bringing us all here together this morning to talk about this centrally important subject that is truly a prerequisite to achieving global goals related to development and human rights, including many of the Sustainable Development Goals, which remain the clearest blueprint of our highest aspirations as a global community. I also want to say thanks to the Population Institute and Kathleen Mogelgaard and her team, who, as always, have their finger on the pulse of the intersection of policy, data, and advocacy on SRHR issues. We all know what SRHR is, right? Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights. I'm with the UN, so there's going to be a lot of acronyms, okay? All right. So thank you for tackling this essential issue and quite literally connecting the dots between SRHR, equality, empowerment, and resources. And Bridget, I am really looking forward to hearing your presentation and what I know is going to be a very insightful discussion with our panelists. I have really been looking forward to this morning, as I know many of you in the room are, because I know we're all going to leave here inspired. So, UNFPA. For the organization that I represent, these issues are central to everything we do. And I realize I want everyone to, in the room who can see Sarah Barnes is wearing a UNFPA scarf, and I want to give a shout out, but yeah, it's beautiful. I don't have one of those scarves, but I'm going to get one. And I realized when I was looking at her scarf, I didn't even make my own connecting the dots, that our logo are dots, orange dots. This is about what we do. For those of you who are unfamiliar with UNFPA, we are the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency. Our mission is to deliver a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. Inherent in everything we do is putting the rights and well-being of women and girls center and promoting volunteerism and gender equality and empowerment. Our motto is ensuring rights and choices for all. So to achieve the promise envisioned in UNFPA's mission and mandate, in 2018, we launched 3 transformational results, also known as what we call the 3 zeros, which we hope to meet by 2030. These 3 zeros are pretty huge. 0 unmet need for family planning, 0 preventable maternal deaths, 0 gender-based violence and harmful practices, including child marriage and female genital mutilation. Progress has been strong, but these goals are purposefully ambitious and the funds available are simply not keeping up. I want to share with you the story of a woman named Francini in Costa Rica, which illuminates or connects the dots on how the game can change when women and girls are able to exercise their human rights and empower themselves. When she became pregnant at age 13, Francini was told that she would have to leave school and that her life was over. And at first, she did. As Francini said, "I was in the 6th grade of school. When you grow up in conditions of vulnerability, you usually do not have access to sensitive scientific information that reaches you correctly and favors autonomous decision-making." Then she found out about a UNFPA women's empowerment program that works with young mothers to get them back into classrooms. Today, Francini is a mother to her son and supports her family by working as a youth facilitator with UNFPA, where she reaches women and girls like herself with valuable sexual and reproductive health and information. Now, I may be aging myself with this next story, but I was very fortunate to be sitting in the room at the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, when then First Lady Hillary Clinton, in her iconic pink suit, looked out across the crowd and said very clearly, "If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all." Despite all the progress we have made since the International Conference on Population and Development, or what we say the ICPD in 1994, or the 4th World Conference on Women in 1995, a generation later, women still have substantially fewer educational opportunities, lower income, less autonomy, and less political power than their male counterparts. According to UN projections, at our current rate of progress, it will take 286 years for the world to achieve gender equality. I'm going to say that again, 286 years. Now, most of you who know me know that I like to joke, and one of my jokes, is it a joke? That is that our opposition wake up every morning determined to undermine every effort we make towards progress. And I think one message I want to say to you all today is that we really need to remember women like Francini and push hard every day, indeed redouble or triple our efforts to achieve Secretary Clinton's vision of giving every woman and girl the ability to realize their dreams and fulfill the opportunities in life they are entitled to. That's why I'm here today, because I am really excited about this report, Connecting the Dots, as it provides us with the facts, the figures, and the policy directions to move us forward. I hope everyone got a copy of the report. Right? Yeah. I was especially struck by the very last passage in the report on page 50, which reads, policymakers must shift their mindsets from seeing SRHR as a siloed and contentious public health issue and instead shape their understanding of SRHR as a prerequisite for bipartisan policy goals related to gender equality and empowerment. Truer words were never written, and in many ways this sentence captures the universal promise and the seemingly intractable challenges in adopting the supremely logical findings and recommendations of this report. It is such a simple concept. If girls and women do not have ready access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services, their ability to achieve equality and empowerment suffers. If girls and women have access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services, their ability to achieve equality and empowerment greatly improves. Women's ability to access education, pursue a career outside the home, or participate politically often hinges on their ability to exercise control and autonomy over their own bodies and reproduction. And, newsflash, when more than half of the world's population thrives, the entire planet thrives. Unfortunately, this remains an aspiration and not the reality, as you all know. Every year, at least 12 million girls are married before they reach the age of 18. That is 28 girls every minute. 1 in every 5 girls is married or in union before reaching age 18. Every day, 20,000 girls under the age of 18 give birth. 129 million girls who should be in school and aren't. And fewer than half of the countries have gender parity and access to primary education. And one of the saddest statistics I know is that globally, complications from pregnancy and childbirth are the leading cause of death for girls aged 15 to 19. I was really pleased when I saw that this report does not just stop with programmatic recommendations. It takes the next crucial step, connects the next dot, to very clearly and explicitly highlighting the funding that is needed to achieve the goals and to address the need. As the report very clearly says, connecting the dots emphasizes the need for the U.S. to increase its support for sexual and reproductive health and rights, both financially and politically, in order to make meaningful progress on advancing its global policy and programmatic priorities of achieving gender equality and empowerment worldwide. The United States government has been an incredibly generous supporter for SRHR for over 50 years, including over $600 million this year, which includes over $30 million in core funding for UNFPA. We are extremely grateful for the strong political and financial support of the Biden administration to UNFPA as well as to overall SRHR. It has really been incredibly gratifying. But there is a big problem, because U.S. funding 10 years ago was at nearly identical levels. The transformative progress we all want and need is not likely on a stagnant budget. This report is very valuable in doing the calculations and naming the United States' fair share of global family planning reproductive health assistance. All right, if you haven't read the report, spoiler alert, the number is almost 3 times the amount the U.S. currently allocates. And even this number would not achieve all the essential elements of UNFPA's 3 zeros: 0 unmet need, 0 preventable maternal death, and 0 gender-based violence. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do. The Population Institute and their report also address the critically important pivotal role the U.S. can play politically. I'm going to let the panel delve into a discussion on what policy can help or hinder local organizations from being able to operate efficiently and effectively to help girls like Francini. But I want to emphasize that the political environment has to end where any discussion on progress in the advancement of girls' empowerment, women and girls' rights, or women and girls' health immediately gets derailed in partisan politics. We don't need a silver bullet or a cure. We know what to do. What we need is political will. As this report lays out, we honestly have a pretty good handle on what needs to be done to advance these issues. But artificial roadblocks put in place for narrow political rather than broadly helpful policy reasons all too often set us back rather than propelling us forward. Finally, in conclusion, I just want to say that this report, the timing is perfect. Right now, countries are preparing to participate in next year's 30th anniversary of the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development. Regional preparatory meetings are happening now, and it is no surprise that many countries are calling for comprehensive and effective SRHR policies and programs coupled with an alignment of resources. Rights and empowerment will almost certainly be at the top of the agenda, and a discussion of policy and resources will not be far behind. As they did in 1994, the U.S. will lead in ICPD 30, and I know everyone in this room is going to partner and advocate for the U.S. to continue to be a robust voice in the process. So finally, I wanted to leave you all today with an inspirational quote. So I didn't go to ChatGPT, but I did type in quote on connecting the dots to Google, and I received 25 different quotes about connecting the dots, all attributed to Steve Jobs. Okay, so I thought we could have an entire session just discussing that interesting fact. But instead, I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite evergreen quotes from Margaret Mead, which I've slightly doctored for the occasion, so apologies to Margaret, and thank you. Never underestimate the ability of a few individuals to connect the dots and change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that it ever has. I look forward to hearing from the panel today, and I look forward to hearing how we engage in dialogue with this audience. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your comments, expertise, and more on UNFPA's incredible work in this area. We will now turn to our partners at the Population Institute to present the findings and recommendations from the Connecting the Dots report. It is my pleasure to introduce Maniza Habib, Research Associate for the Population Institute, where she supports the research department in the production of reports, policy briefs, and other research activities related to domestic and international reproductive health and rights. She is also one of the co-authors of the Connecting the Dots report. At this time, I'd also like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Bridget Kelly, who will take us into our panel discussion. Bridget is a Doctor of Public Health candidate at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Prior to starting this program, Bridget was the Director of Research for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights at the Population Institute and is also a co-author of the report today. And if you'd like to read our speakers' full bios, they are available at the QR code outside of the auditorium. And Maniza, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dikshita. Before I dive in, we're going to just present a video. Sorry, I'm short. Present a video of our, just a brief overview of the findings of the report.
Global gender equality and empowerment are widely agreed upon U.S. policy goals. Achieving these goals requires commitment to women's health, freedom from violence, and equal participation in education, the workforce, and politics. These important issues are directly impacted by the availability and accessibility of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services. Services like family planning, safe abortion, STI treatment, and the prevention of gender-based violence. Child marriage and unintended pregnancy, for example, can be both a cause and a result of girls not being in school. A lack of investment in sexual and reproductive health and rights, or SRHR, prevents women and girls from exercising basic human rights. The U.S. contributes around $607 million to international family planning and reproductive health programming, yet the fair share calculation suggests this should be $1.74 billion annually. Moreover, restrictive U.S. foreign policy and funding are not inclusive of all components of reproductive health. Therefore, we must not only increase our financial support for SRHR, but also change the way we see it politically. SRHR should not be viewed as a siloed and contentious public health issue, but as a prerequisite for bipartisan policy goals, paving the way for real progress in global gender equality and empowerment.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just gonna, do you mind pulling up the slides? I don't know if there. I'm not sure if it's working. What's a post-COVID event without one technical difficulty or two? Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you so much. Firstly, I want to thank Sarah for the introduction to the report and just hitting on some of those key themes. And I hope the video provided some context for the conversation that we'll be having today about what is needed from the US for sexual and reproductive health and why it is needed in achieving global gender equality. So firstly, so that we're all on the same page, what is the SRHR agenda? What we have it involve is comprehensive family planning services, maternal health care, infertility treatment, safe abortion and post-abortion care, prevention, care, and treatment of STIs, HIV/AIDS, reproductive tract infections, and reproductive cancers, as well as the prevention and treatment of gender-based violence. So it encompasses more than just family planning and reproductive health activities. And secondly, why is gender equality and empowerment so important for this? Well, already achieving gender equality and empowerment are universally agreed upon goals, as well as widely considered critical across party affiliations. So therefore, recognizing the direct impact of the availability and accessibility of comprehensive sexual health services on gender equality is important for advancing both of these goals. So the gender equality empowerment covers a range of issue areas, including girls' education, women, peace and security, women's economic empowerment, and women's political empowerment. So for the past couple of months, a series of blogs written by the co-authors of Connecting the Dots was released on these different issue areas and their bipartisan policy objectives, as well as their mutually reinforcing components with access to SRHR. So if you're interested, you should check them out on the .mom blog of the New Security Beat of Wilson Center. So just give you a little context. For example, access to quality of education is a necessary element of gender equality. So a lack of access to SRH services drives a high rates of unintended adolescent pregnancy, which can have impacts on school absenteeism, which hinders progress in girls' education. In women's economic empowerment, for example, research shows that women's ability to choose when and where to work is inextricably linked to their freedom and ability to choose the timing, spacing, and number of their births. In strengthening women's political involvement, improving SRHR conditions worldwide can impact the ability of women to be politically active, as well as have more women in office can impact availability and accessibility of SRHR for all. Meeting the demand for modern contraception and reproductive health, dramatically reducing gender-based violence, harmful practices, and protecting sexual health and rights are necessary ingredients to strengthening women's political participation and decision-making ability. And finally, access to SRHR services can enable women's ability to participate in paths to peace. So bridging these gaps in SRHR is crucial for enforcing women's bodily autonomy that can better enable women to participate in peace-building efforts. And all of this is just to say that channeling efforts to improving gender equality and women's empowerment without connecting the dots between women's access to SRHR and participating in the education, workforce, politics, and peace building would inevitably weaken all of those efforts. So what exactly is being done currently? It's hard to tell exactly how much the United States contributes to the SRHR agenda, since support for various components flows through multiple budget and appropriations line items, such as the bilateral family planning / reproductive, maternal and child health, the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, contributions to the United Nations Population Fund, as Sarah spoke about, and other multilateral funding avenues. But for fiscal year 22, the U.S. contributed a total of $607.5 million to just the family planning and reproductive programming efforts. These fundings are restricted by certain policies, such as the Global Gag Rule, which prohibits performing or promoting legal abortion services as a method of family planning by NGOs, foreign NGOs that receive U.S. family planning assistance. The Kemp-Kasten Amendment, which limits U.S. support for the UNFPA due to certain provisions related to abortion, and then the Helms Amendment, which states that no foreign assistance funds may be used to pay for the performance of abortion as a method of family planning. So now we come to what more is needed. So as you can see, there are many issue-related areas related and need funding in order to achieve global gender empowerment and equality. So robust funding is required, meaning that the United States needs to increase its support for family planning reproductive health programming to its estimated share, which is calculated to be $1.736 billion, which is very different from its $160 million currently, which has stayed pretty stagnant, as you can see on the graph. It's also important to understand, like we said in the beginning, that SRHR agenda encompasses more than just family planning and reproductive health, namely abortion care and fertility treatment. So further U.S. funding is still needed to ensure full realization of SRHR access. There also needs to be more investment in progressive policies that do not restrict funding for SRHR programming, such as passing the Global HER Act, which would permanently repeal the global gag rule, or passing the Abortion is Healthcare Everywhere Act, which would repeal the Helms Amendment and modifications to Kemp-Kasten, so UNFPA funds are not wrongfully withheld. And finally, a committed focus is needed, which indicates a specific attention on systemically excluded groups, including ethnic minorities, forcibly displaced people, indigenous people, sex workers, young people, and those are part of the LGBT community, just to name a few groups. So generally, we hope to demonstrate, as Sarah pointed out, that the progress in SRHR is necessary for gender equality, rather than view SRHR as a contentious and siloed issue. And finally, why now? So global SRHR not only needs to happen because it's necessary for all to access these resources, but right now we need to keep up with the pace of SRH needs of the generation. So with 1.8 billion people ages 10 to 25 living in this world currently, the largest youth generation in history, and these numbers are just expected to grow, it is clear that there is a large SRHR need in the population currently, and that it's just going to grow. So to be able to fulfill all of everyone's right to SRHR and further propel towards gender equality, we need to be able to meet these demands. Well, thank you so much for listening to my spiel, and I hope the panel goes into some of the more specifics of the need for SRHR and gender equality.
Thank you so much, Maniza, for giving such a great presentation on the Connecting the Dots report. And thank you also so much for all your work on not just the report itself, but also disseminating and presenting the findings throughout this past year. It's been such a pleasure to work with you. Hi, as I was so kindly introduced, I'm Bridget Kelly. I am the former Director of Research for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights at the Population Institute. And I just want to thank every one of you for attending, both in person and online today as we launch this report. Really, my main goal for today is that I really hope that this conversation that we have with this esteemed panel can really highlight just how crucial support for the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda is to advancing U.S. bipartisan policy goals of achieving gender equality and empowerment worldwide. I hope that we can demonstrate just how progress in these areas requires that the U.S. address the barriers that are so deeply entrenched in our funding allocations, but also in our foreign policies, and that they work together essentially to prevent people from around the world from achieving their optimal health and well-being. Conversations like the one that we're having today are just so critical to our goal, as Sarah so kindly put it, of shifting policymakers' mindsets from seeing this as a contentious and siloed policy or health issue. And instead, we really need to shift it to seeing it as prerequisites for achieving these goals of gender equality and empowerment. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists and then dive right into our discussion. But before I do that, I do just want to send a quick reminder to all of our audience members. We're going to have a 20-minute end of the question and answer session at the end of this event. So if you could, please jot down your questions and hold them till the end of the panel, and then we'll have people pass around microphones here in the audience, or in person, excuse me. But for those of you joining online, you can submit your questions through the chat box below the webcast video, and then our team will share them with me. And of course, just a friendly reminder, if you're following the conversation and would like to tweet on what was formerly known as Twitter, you can use the hashtags MHDialogue or hashtag connecting the dots to SRHR. Okay, I'm very honored to introduce our guest today, starting with Humphrey Nabimanyan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I got it? Great, thank you. Humphrey is the founder and CEO of Reach a Hand Uganda, a youth-led nonprofit organization focused on youth empowerment, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and HIV/AIDS awareness and prevention. Humphrey is a Ugandan social entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a peer educator who's empowering youth in the African continent through education about sexual and reproductive health and rights. Welcome, Humphrey. Glad you could join us. Caitlin Horrigan is the Senior Director of Global Advocacy at Planned Parenthood Federation of America, or commonly referred to as PPFA. With nearly 15 years of foreign policy experience, Caitlin drives PPFA's global advocacy agenda with Congress and the administration to protect and expand funding policies that advance sexual and reproductive health and rights worldwide. Thank you for being with us, Caitlin. And Bergen Cooper joining us virtually. Thank you so much for being here, Bergen. Bergen Cooper is the Director of Policy Research at FOS Feminista, an international feminist alliance centered around sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice for women, girls, and gender diverse people. She is the architect of the SRHR Index, which we will get into just a little bit, and a nonprofit leader, researcher, and advocate with more than a decade of experience in the sexual and reproductive health and rights field. Thanks so much for joining us virtually, Bergen. Great. Well, I would, I would love to start this conversation from your perspective, Humphrey. Gotta get used to moving around. Apologies. Your work as founder and CEO of Reach a Hand Uganda is cross-sectional. You are working to increase access to information and services related to sexual and reproductive health and rights for young people so that they can be empowered to live healthy, focused, and productive lives. So as we heard from Sarah and Maniza previously, the connections between sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender empowerment are plentiful. But from your perspective, can you tell us how important sexual and reproductive health services are to the economic and the political empowerment of young people in Uganda?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll really dive into the conversation and also focusing to the unveiling environments that we all live in, especially in the development countries like Uganda, where comprehensive sexual reproductive health and rights, information and service in countries like ours, where it has a lot of contentious issues. Contentious issues in terms of how it's pronounced, contentious issues on how even the acronyms that UNFPA sings about every day is kind of questioned, from the terms of comprehensiveness, the R, which represents rights. So this is more of a contentious issue that really goes to the well-being of young people in the country. And also it comes to what you're asking about in terms of looking at Uganda like any other countries that have signed up commitments on the international level, looking at the SDGs, the Maputo protocols, and others, that it's moral for them to uphold them, but also it's immoral for them not practicing and also be able to implement some of these commitments that they've been able to sign. And this comes in terms of budgeting of our national budgets. How are they really allocating, funding to support SRHR for the young people? And also looking that we are living in a political landscape, even some of this is being questioned on a daily basis and also bring a lot of underdevelopment issues. But also looking at our landscape, how can it really be impactful to the young people? We're looking at human capital. A population like ours, where 70% plus is a population of young people, and looking at human capital development is one of the most important aspects that we really depend on as young people. Our economy depends on that to grow. Our social capital as well depends on the human capital that we live with to grow in different sectors. And costs associated with unintended pregnancies, we see sexual reproductive health transmissions. So we believe that by investing in SRHR for young people can save substantial healthcare expenses, which can channel towards another economic needs of the country. But we are spending quite a lot of money investing in stopping some of this. We're looking at gender equality. SRHR, as we know that in Uganda, equality is one of the things that we really treasure most. But in most parts of the world, women often bear the brunt of unintended pregnancy, that lack access to SRHR services, and also by prioritizing, we know that we can empower young women and girls to take control of their lives and even play a more active role in the political landscape of the country. So there's so much that we are kind of intense with, but also looking at the investment in the healthcare that is quite taking a lot of money, and also lack of services that young people are not able to even be able to access is kind of a hindrance to a country like ours that is growing and also not prioritizing part of the SRHR. We're looking at political participation, and also countries like ours in terms of ensuring young people to have a say in their sexual and reproductive health fosters the sense of urgency, and also this empowerment translates into greater political engagement of the young people, especially the individuals, of their rights to advocate for policies and initiatives to safeguard for the SRHR. The parliament that we have in Uganda has about 2% of representation of the young people. Our population that is over 70%. So how can we have more representation in political landscapes whereby young people can take charge in designing policies, take charge in implementing them, take charge in even monitoring whether these policies are quite working for the whole population of the country to benefit. So those are some of the points that I would love to give on this matter, but I feel like there's so much that needs to be done. There's so much that we need to adhere so that we can be able to save our young generation, because the young generation of today needs quite a lot of investment. We are looking at funding cuts, and with all the policies that we are able to develop and the kind of effect that is bringing to that. And also looking at even the role model countries that we are looking at, even some of these things are really happening, looking at the gang rules and other things. So it's attack on humanity. It's not attack on only SRHR, but attack in different sectors that we're living with in the country. Thank you.
Wow, Humphrey, that was so many powerful statements that you had just highlighted. Thank you so much. I've been jotting down a few. And one that really caught my attention was spending money on prohibiting progress. I think that's maybe not just a common theme, unfortunately, in Uganda, but around the world, including with our U.S. funding. And as Maniza so kindly brought up, that there are 1.8 billion people between the ages of 10 to 24 in this youth generation. And you talked about how we need to invest in this generation to ensure that we have healthy communities for Uganda and for around the world. I think this is a great segue to you, Caitlin. As we've heard, adequate funding is needed to ensure that people have access to the services that they need to have optimal health and of course, well-being. Maniza touched upon the fair share calculation and the importance of increasing U.S.'s commitment to international family planning and reproductive health programming through robust financial support. I believe the number of 1.736 was brought up, billion. Can you expand upon the meaning of fair share and the figure itself and what that actually entails?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much for bringing us together, and congratulations on what I think is a very powerful Connecting the Dots report. I really appreciate the urgent call for centering sexual and reproductive health and rights as essential to delivering on gender equity and empowerment. And of course, that can't happen if it's not funded. So that's why Planned Parenthood, Population Institute, and so many advocates have really rallied behind asking the U.S. government to invest $1.74 billion. I round. I'm talking the math, so I'll try to make it easy. Annually for international family planning and reproductive health care. And this ask has been widely advocated for, including most recently, there was a blueprint for sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice that many of us worked on together that echoed this ask as a call to the administration. And certainly, as Congress is constantly debating funding throughout the appropriation cycle, it's something that many of us are advocating there. So let me take a step back and talk about where this ask comes from. It's really based on two core things. One is the global need, and the statistic that I think is the North Star when we think about the global need is that there are currently 218 million women of reproductive age in low and middle income countries who have an unmet need for contraception. So that's a motivating factor for so many of us doing this work to close that gap and address that unmet need. Colleagues at the Guttmacher Institute have helped cost what it would take to meet not only their need, but also to, of course, maintain people who currently have access, because we can't lose ground on any front. So we know what that would cost. Again, to Sarah's point, we often know what the challenge is before us. We just need the political will and the funding to get there. And then the second component of the ask is a conceptualization of a U.S. fair share. And by that we mean, what would it look like for the U.S. to really do its part to tackle this global challenge? We're not saying that the U.S. alone should solve this challenge, but certainly we think they should do their part. And while they have long been a leader, if they were truly to lead, more is needed. And for this, we turn to another thing we heard from Sarah about the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, which brought 179 UN member states together to agree on a program of action, including a costed plan for how to get there. And so this guiding document tells us that 1/3 of the resources needed to tackle this global challenge should come from donor countries like the United States. And so, Planned Parenthood Global is, of course, investing in partners like Reach a Hand Uganda to support growing national budgets everywhere, but we really do want to see the U.S. do its own fair share. And so based on the U.S.'s relative wealth compared to other donor countries, we should be picking up 41% of that 1/3 allocation of the total global need. So it's really taken those two things together, the global need and the U.S. fair share, that we arrive on the $1.74 billion ask. Unfortunately, as you've heard from others, we are well short of that area. And for really over a decade, we've hovered at about $600 million invested in this space. And that's combined our U.S. investment in our bilateral family planning program led by USAID and our U.S. contribution to UNFPA. And of course, when you think about that 10-year plus period, the purchasing power has decreased. So, we say that it's flat, but it's actually, we're able to do less with that funding because of things like inflation. So obviously jumping from that stagnant $600 million amount to the $1.74 billion would be quite a dramatic leap. And Congress isn't great at dramatic leaps these days. It would be more than tripling of the funding. But I think it's been important for the advocacy community to stay true to really articulating where the need is and where we want the government to go. We know we'll never get there if we're not clear on our facts and information, but also dream big on where we would like to see the world to go. Maybe I'll close by saying, we've talked about math here, but I think truly important in the math and sort of talking about funding numbers has been to talk about the real impact on people's lives. And we know, thanks to colleagues at the Guttmacher Institute, about what meeting this funding level would translate into. And they have a lot of statistics. I'll leave you with one. It would mean 70 million more people would have access to reproductive health care. And when you think about Sarah's story of Francini and what that would mean to replicate 70 million more times, how many girls would be able to stay in school, how many women would be able to pursue, the jobs and careers that they wanted, how many people would be able to avoid an unintended pregnancy and build the family that they want when they want it. Truly transformative. It's hard to undersell. So I'll close just by saying we're at a pivotal moment for debates on these funding when it comes to the U.S. government. Right now, current levels are secure through November 17th, and then who knows what happens afterwards. They have to act, or we might face a shutdown. But I think it's worth underscoring that the House and Senate have put forward pretty radically different visions for funding in this program area. The House would propose a 25% cut and a complete elimination and bar on funding to UNFPA, which would be truly devastating around the world. Thankfully, the Senate has provided alternative vision with a $27.5 million increase to this funding. This is obviously well short of the needs-based ask, the $1.74 billion, but it would be a long overdue step in the right direction and actually has bipartisan support from the key committee in the Senate that allocates funding. So we'll certainly be out there fighting for that because, each dollar means more access and the transformative benefits that you hear about in the report. So we look forward to working with many of you to see through those increases.
That's such an important part that you just said. Each dollar has meaning, and that's so important. And as you said, this is a big ask. Sarah, you said the goals are ambitious, but the fundings are not keeping up. The funding's not keeping up. And so I just want to highlight one more thing that you brought up is that the U.S. is not asked to be doing this alone or going at this alone, but it's just being asked to do its fair share in this work. But we also know, as we heard from Anisa, that there are restrictions to our funding, too. It's not just the levels. There are the restriction aspect to this, too. So, Bergen, I would like to bring you into the conversation. As I had mentioned while introducing you, you are the architect of the SRHR Index. And this was used in the Connecting the Dots report to really highlight all of the components that are included under the SRHR umbrella. Can you elaborate for us on what the importance is behind the SRHR Index? And then additionally, if you will, what needs to happen to include those components that are currently being overlooked or excluded from a policy perspective?
Yes, happy to. And thank you. And I'm so sorry I'm not with you all in person today. I see so many of my friends in the audience, and I'm sending you all big hugs. And I want to extend my thanks to the Population Institute and the Wilson Center for bringing us together today. And I have to say, Connecting the Dots it's an excellent report, and it provides a solid roadmap of U.S. engagement on SRHR. I feel like at this point in the program, I can say SRHR. I feel like we're all good on the acronym. And I was really excited to see the index cited throughout. To give folks some background, the SRHR Index it's a tool to hold the U.S. government accountable to its commitment on sexual and reproductive health and rights in U.S. global health assistance. So it was created way back in 2017 by Change, which is now Fos Feminista, in partnership with the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University. And the SRHR Index, it scores actors who work in U.S. global health assistance, like the White House and Congress and Department of State and USAID and Health and Human Services and Department of Defense. And for each actor, we grade them on the domains in which they work. So those who work in family planning, those who work in maternal and child health, those who work in HIV and AIDS. And we chose those domains based on the core funding streams of U.S. global health assistance. So these domains should not be thought of as what's important in U.S. global health assistance. Rather, it is what is funded in U.S. global health assistance. So the annual grades that come out from the index, they're able to compare what is being done by these actors in these domains compared to what should be done to promote sexual and reproductive health and rights in U.S. global health assistance. And how we grade matters. Connecting the Dots, I have this quote here. Connecting the Dots said, while reaching long excluded groups can be difficult and expensive, it should be a central priority of U.S. funding efforts. I could not agree more. And the index allows us to assess the U.S. government's ability to reach long excluded groups. And it does that by using what we call cross-cutting issues. So we score specific actions from each of these actors. So like the White House, for example, we might be scoring an executive action that came out. Or for Congress, we might be scoring a piece of legislation that was passed. Agencies are a little more complicated. With the Department of State, for example, we could be scoring a frequently asked questions document that they release for all of their partners around the world who are implementing programs with US Global Health Assistance. Or with USAID, for example, we might be scoring one of their online e-learning courses, which allow partners to understand policies and legislation as they impact US global health assistance. So for all of these actions, I come back to these cross-cutting issues. So for all of these actions, we score whether the action is based in evidence, responsive to need, situated within internationally recognized human rights norms, and if it's gender transformative. So by using these cross-cutting issues, we're able to assess whether or not these actions from the US government go beyond reaching the general population. Are the actions of the US government responsive to needs of LGBTQI populations, of people facing infertility, of sex workers, of young people, of older people? So I think connecting the dots does a really good job of explaining what it takes to fulfill the SRHR agenda, increase funding, and expanding the reach of US foreign assistance. In terms of expanding the reach, yes, a focus on abortion and infertility would expand the reach of US foreign assistance. I know that many of you in the room and online know about the Helms Amendment. It was passed in 1973, and it was the first abortion restriction that was added to the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. And it states that no foreign assistance funds may be used to pay for the performance of abortion as a method of family planning or to motivate or coerce any person to practice abortions. So under U.S. law, at a bare minimum, cases of rape and incest and life endangerment, they fall outside of the scope of abortion as a method of family planning. But implementing agencies, the ones that we're talking about that we score in the index, like USAID and Health and Human Services, they have treated the Helms Amendment as a total ban on abortion. So as Connecting the Dots so aptly points out, funding maternal health care without funding abortion when unsafe abortion is one of the leading causes of maternal mortality worldwide is, at the nicest way I can say, is totally illogical, or it's not based on evidence, it's not based in human rights. So let's go back to that USAID e-learning course that I mentioned earlier. They have one on US family planning and abortion requirements. And the course as it is now, it focuses on what you can't do with US global health assistance when it comes to abortion. What about what you can do? What if the course highlighted what partners could do, even with Helms in place, or other abortion amendments like Leahy or Siljander? You know, as Caitlin and Humphrey talked about, from a human rights perspective, this would certainly increase partners' knowledge and access to health services worldwide. From an index perspective, it would certainly raise the grades of the US government. Listen, I want to be aware of time. I could talk about the index all day. I will wrap up by saying that the new grades are coming out next month. So be sure to check in and see how the US government is doing. And I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Bergen. And yes, I'm eagerly awaiting the release of the new grades. And you brought up, so thank you so much for giving a great overview of the Helms Amendment and the implications that has, especially on the implementation of the Helms Amendment. And I love this idea of what can you do under these restrictions, because we can do things, but it's hard when we're not taught what can be done. So I appreciate that. I think I'm going to go right back to you, Caitlin, because as we had just heard, there are these components like abortion that are overlooked and truly excluded from our work, U.S.'s foreign work. And so can you tell us a little bit more about the implications of the anti-abortion policies, like we just heard the Helms Amendment, but also like declarations like the Geneva Consensus, and the implications that these have on advancing gender equality and empowerment worldwide?
Sure. Well, let me state it plainly. I think anti-abortion restrictions are incompatible with gender equality. These magnify actually inequality, and we know that the burdens that they impose fall most harshly on individuals and communities who already face numerous and intersecting forms of discrimination and barriers to care. For example, Planned Parenthood Global did analysis and research when the global gag rule was last in place under the previous administration, and found that those who experienced the negative impacts of the policy first and most were communities like women, LGBTI, and young people, who again already face numerous barriers to care. So these restrictions, as has been laid out by Bergen in the report, are far too common in U.S. law. And in fact, we know many in Congress are actively trying to expand their reach or introduce new ones to impact more programs and people. And if they're successful, they would not only undermine our investments, but I think Sarah told us that we're already 286 years away from gender equality. My goodness, how far further back would we be pushed from achieving that goal if new restrictions are put in place, or if, frankly, we don't get rid of the ones that we're already dealing with? There is some hope on the flip side. We do have an administration who I think gets the connection between sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender equality. And in fact, if you look at the national strategy that they released on gender equity and equality, SRHR is explicitly mentioned as key to that. And in fact, ending a policy like the global gag rule was also articulated as essential to delivering on these bigger goals. They rightly identified that these restrictions create disproportionate burden on women and really undermine their ability to take care of their families, to pursue economic empowerment and activities, and really to lead in all sectors, connecting the dots there. When I think about some of these restrictions, I can't help and I risk aging myself, but just contemplate that these restrictions have been around our entire lives. Many of us don't know a world of what it would be like to live out from under the shadow of the global gag rule, which will be 40 next year. Helms is 50 this year. That hasn't stopped us from working. And in fact, much of the world has sort of moved beyond and in spite of us and made progress on expanding abortion access. But it's hard to fully contemplate what more we could achieve if the U.S., as the biggest donor of international family planning, lifted those restrictions and could really be in solidarity with a partner like Reach a Hand Uganda, doing incredible work, pushing for access in their own communities. I think we talk a lot about sort of the SRHR restrictions and their impact on information and services, but there are other ways that they really harm and disrupt efforts to promote gender equality that we don't talk about as much. So I'll just name maybe two quickly. One is that they really destroy partnerships. When you think about a policy like the global gag rule, it asks organizations to choose sides, to choose to comply with the policy and keep the U.S. funding, or give up the funding and keep your ability to do comprehensive care. And when we force organizations to separate, we destroy coalitions, and we destroy the ability to work collectively to tackle big challenges, whether it's ending maternal mortality or achieving gender equality. These policies also serve to silo, and that's a word that I've heard many mention up here, and really separate out and treat abortion as something different, which again undermines the ability to think holistically about what it would take to achieve gender equality. And I think access to abortion and the ability to plan and determine your own family is certainly a part of that. On the positive side, because I hate being only gloom and doom and wouldn't have survived working in this space as long as I had if I didn't, find things to be hopeful about. I do see a welcome shift. There's more work to do of more people seeing themselves in each other's struggles, to understand the interrelationship between our shared work and where attacks happen in one space, rallying to stop them, and to have a shared vision about where we're all going together. I've certainly seen it on the diversity of orgs calling for an end to the global gag rule, as well as those who rallied with us to work on the blueprint for sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. It wasn't just repro groups who came together to do that. You see among the signatories LGBTI groups, HIV groups, those working with refugees, those focused on GBV, really coming together with a shared vision of where we want to go. I think you also see this kind of cross-sector solidarity in the global movement towards feminist foreign policy. So those are some of the hopeful antidotes, I think, to things like the Geneva Consensus Declaration, right, which was really a fake thing created by the previous administration that was not developed with consensus or in any formal process. So obviously there's lots more work to do, but I do think there's a collective resistance that is happening and an alternative vision for the world. And I think being clear on where you want to get to is part of the battle in getting there.
Oh, that's great, Caitlin. The collective resistance is a really great term for it. I appreciate that. Humphrey, we just heard Caitlin discuss about the destruction of partnerships because of these policies and the inability to work in coalition on some of these issues because of the restrictions from U.S. policies. So I'm curious, from your perspective, as someone who's working to really increase access to sexual and reproductive health services for youth in Uganda, how do you see U.S.'s restrictive policies on abortion playing out in your work? But also, in May of this year, Uganda enacted one of the most severe anti-LGBTQ laws around the world. And how do you see that law impacting youth access to sexual and reproductive health and rights?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to answer freely and also to give you a general perspective, because my role here is also to give you a new feel on how things are on the ground. First of all, I've been privileged to travel over 52 districts in Uganda that we're working in as Reach a Hand Uganda. And also across those districts, we are trying to increase access of family planning and reproductive health information across to all the young people that we work with. But also I've been privileged to be in the States for over a month, and I've been able to go to about 6 states, trying also to collect different perspectives. Also I'm meeting different people. And one of the things I've realized that the issue that Uganda is facing right now, I might say, so it says like COVID, when it started from a certain part of the world, and we thought it is going to stay there. And then eventually, by the time we woke up, it was everywhere. And then it caused a total shutdown of the entire world. Now, what is happening in Uganda, it is not a Ugandan issue. And also what we see in Uganda as a Western kind of culture infringement in Uganda is not that issue. It's more of an issue to humanity. It's more an issue for our own existence. Now, the shelter and the attack to comprehensive sexuality education, to access of family planning, access of quality health care for young people to be able to access safe abortion services, it is being sheltered by an attack on sexual minorities as more of an LGBTI law that is being enacted. But the big fight is on a bigger perspective of comprehensive sexuality education, of empowering young people to understand who they are, to make informed choices in terms of being economic independent, by understanding that having a smaller family, I can be able to be more economically independent, by understanding that making the right choices, I can be able to fight against HIV and AIDS and live a healthy life, by understanding that even what we are calling now the Black history, to understand there was a war between religion and other people, but now we are looking at immoral, what we call immoral and what we call morality. And that's a kind of attack and the situation that we are living in. But if we understand that it's not only about the sexual minorities, it is about the broader, bigger issue, I think that we shall be able to understand what we are addressing today and what kind of policies can we be able to fight. And also this calls out in partnership for everyone. Progressive countries, for example, like the United States of America, after how many years, and we are seeing the global gang rule that is being passed, and the kind of conflict that that has been talked about, that has been created. Even the partners, let's say PPFA is working with on the down south, because also we are kind of put in terms of choosing sides. Am I pro-abortion? Am I for abortion? You get it. So am I more of an LGBTI inclusive, or I'm not LGBTI inclusive? Am I seeing morally right? Am I seeing immorally right? So this debate is not only a Ugandan debate, it's a whole world debate. We are now looking at, I might say, I'm not, so it sounds a little bit political, but we are used as a political scam. You know, who's taking what, who's taking what? Which side am I on? Which side am I being supported on? So we have to understand these issues from our context, and understand how to address them, and we get into partnerships. We're looking at funding, for example. Why do sexual reproductive health programs receive restricted funding, and programs that are fighting sexual reproductive health and rights receive unrestricted funding from the same development countries that we're working with? Because that's what is happening. How are you going to be able to have a movement of people that are going to understand their rights, understand their movement on what they are standing for, and then you have another movement that is being invested in heavily that is fighting this movement? Already the conflict is being caused by all of us. Look, the funding cuts that are imposed on UNFPA, on Planned Parenthood, that we are working with back in the country. The grassroots organizations are having a huge attack. For example, if Reach a Hand is closed today, nowhere. And the impact we're creating in the communities, nowhere. Unlike international organizations that we are working with, if they are closed, they can choose another country where progressive laws and policies are. You get, so we need that. If you look at now the policies that are being passed within the US and how it's been affecting us, look at COVID alone. How many teenage mothers do we have now, apparently, that were not even able to go back to school? Look at the increase of the stigmatization that has come back today. We're talking about the Gen Z economy right now, and we're having stigmatization, young people running off the streets because they have fear of their lives. And that's what is happening. And the same thing that is happening back in Africa, let's not shadow, sometimes it also happens here in certain families. I've been there, whereby some of their children are being kept in the houses because they don't want to associate the other side. They don't want to shame the family name and so many things. So it is not an African issue. And this is something that we tell back in Uganda. It is not a Western culture issue. It's an issue of humanity, that humanity has lived in existence, and some of these things have been happening. It's about how do we embrace them and live together so that we can even increase access of certain qualities of services that we need in our societies. So that's for me to give you my own perspective, not that I've gone to the chat GTP. Yeah. It's about giving the reality on what is happening and also how we feel as the country. Thank you.
Yeah. That's incredible, Humphrey. And again, scribbling down a lot of notes as you talked. I love really how you frame this, that this is not a Ugandan debate. This is not a Ugandan issue. This is a whole world debate. This is a whole world issue. And unfortunately, it seems as though we have a very loud anti-abortion voice, anti-LGBTQI voice coming from the United States. So I will hopefully open it up real quickly to the audience to take some questions, but I do want to turn it to you, Bergen, for one really important question on this topic. We're talking about how the U.S. needs to bolster investments, increased funding, and some pretty progressive policy change to advance global SRHR in an effort to achieve gender equality. But as we just heard, we're up against some pretty big debates going on, and we are not excluded from that. It's really hard to ignore what's going on in the U.S. right now in terms of restricted sexual and reproductive health rights. So can you elaborate a little bit on what does the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the U.S. mean for the U.S.'s global leadership on topics such as gender equality and empowerment?
Sure. It's not good. I mean, I will go into more detail, but it's not good. I look at the predictions that you made in connecting the dots, and I have to say that they came true. You predicted that you talked about the US Supreme Court ruling doesn't have jurisdiction in other countries, but decisions passed down from the court can influence laws beyond US borders. Yes, that has happened. You said that organizations and implementing partners operating with US funds may refrain from providing abortion with their own funds in an effort to not to inadvertently lose funding due to a lack of clarity on US policy. Yes, that has happened. And I know this because we have conducted research with our partners across Colombia, India, Kenya, and Nigeria to assess what is the global impact of Dobbs on policy, on legislation, on public narratives, on movements. And I can tell you that interviewees across Colombia, Kenya, and Nigeria all reported that the Dobbs decision built upon a recent foundation of anti-abortion mobilization that originated from the United States through the implementation of the global gag rule. In Kenya, we spoke to respondents who had noted that there had been no effort to explain how Dobbs would impact US funding. In Kenya and in Nigeria, policymakers spoke to us about having concerns and beginning to self-censor from the inclusion of the provision of safe abortion in line with national law in policy and in practice in anticipation of the global gag rule coming back in place because of the Dobbs decision. Now, the Dobbs decision does not impact US foreign assistance. That message has not been heard around the world based on the interviews that we have had. In terms of the influence on laws, yes, as I said, this happened. This happened in Kenya. This happened in Nigeria. In Kenya in May of 2022, the High Court in Malindi, Kenya, affirmed abortion as a fundamental right under the Constitution of Kenya. This was a truly exciting moment, and the judge drew on various international laws related to abortion, including Roe v. Wade. So, following the Dobbs decision, opposition groups seized that opportunity to claim that the judge had relied on, quote, bad law. And they successfully persuaded the Court of Appeal to agree to an application to stay the implementation of the Malindi law and policy directions. Again, in Nigeria, Dobbs was utilized in arguments against the domestication of the safe termination of pregnancy for legal indications guidelines in Lagos State. Listen, I know that's a mouthful, but what we're hearing is that respondents said that Dobbs and anti-guidelines mobilization are linked. So shortly after these guidelines were launched, anti-abortion actors mobilized against these guidelines, citing Dobbs as their justification. And due to pressure from these actors, the Lagos state government directed the suspension of these guidelines 9 days after they were launched. Caitlin mentioned how the world has moved on and moved far beyond the United States in certain areas of sexual and reproductive health and rights since ICPD, and that's certainly true. We saw that in interviews that we had across India. I know that so many folks heard the devastating news from the Indian Supreme Court last month, returning the decision on same-sex marriage to the states. While that hearing was going on, India Supreme Court, the Solicitor General referenced Dobbs in the decision arguing against same-sex marriage, and he said the decision should be left to Parliament, similar to how the Dobbs decision returned the issue of abortion to the states. And that's when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in India rebuked that and said, don't cite Dobbs, and this is a quote, don't cite Dobbs because we have gone far beyond the Dobbs decision here. And fortunately so, we can give credit to ourselves that we are far ahead of Western countries. I want to wrap up for time. I just want to cite that as there is an anti-gender movement and an anti-abortion movement on the rise, we cannot take the United States out of that. The United States is a part of that movement. And we do have a strong administration right now that is in support of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I look forward to that administration being able to combat this movement. I'll pause there.
Apologies for the coughing fit up here. Thank you so much, Bergen. That was truly terrifying at points, but it's a great reminder of how important what's going on in the U.S. can really impact outside of the U.S. borders. So thank you so much. I would love to now open it to questions from the audience, if there's any burning questions in person. We have a question from somebody online that I would like to share. It says, we know that SRHR and gender issues are often forgotten in the onset of a crisis or conflict when they become even more critical. How can advocates work to ensure that these issues are included in international security action plans so that these needs are met in times of crisis? Okay, great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anika Manzoor. I'm with the Youth Activism Project, and my question is about the advocacy that's needed for the increase in funding to, I believe it was 1.7 billion. How can everyday people get involved with? I guess it's a two-parter. How can everyday people get involved? And given the current climate with the conflict in the Middle East, does that provide any challenges for that advocacy?
Excellent question. Thank you. Do we have any panelists who want to dive in? Any other questions?
I'm happy to take maybe the first part of the question that you asked about how can everyday people get involved with advocacy to increase funding. You know, I think there is huge power in reaching out to your elected officials, especially in Congress, and letting them know you care about global sexual and reproductive health and rights and want to see it funded. You know, they don't hear often from constituents on foreign policy issues and global issues. And working in this space, we're kind of at the intersection of two contentious areas, right? There's like an America first, like we shouldn't be doing things out in the world opposition that we're facing. And of course, there's opposition to sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I think your voice actually has an outsized benefit in reaching out to them because it's rare for them to hear, and so it's really powerful. So I think letting them know that you're out there, that you care not only about what they do in your own community in the U.S., but about communities around the world, because the opponents are the same, as Humphrey said from his time here. The issues are the same, right? And so letting them know that you're out there, that you care is very powerful, and I'll turn it to my other speakers to add to this question or others.
What I would say is that we're now living in a global village, and a global village that is connecting the dots of all of us together. And creating a movement shouldn't come from a sense of getting funding, but it should come from a sense of creating a belonging, and also us understanding what is more important. So how can we have voices from all over the world to drum about the same issue? I think also that is something that we should really look at in terms of using powerful people, influencers. And we have seen how, let's say, social media has been able to change narratives in different places, from a political landscape, economic landscape, that even in our country we use social media to repair our potholes and also to make sure the government understands that we're dying of potholes, and they're able to do that. So that's a kind of power that we really have as young people, and also start looking at ourselves as young people that are living in a global village. Another thing that I wanted to add on is that right now, especially in development countries like ours, young people are kind of distancing themselves away from politics. They're distancing themselves away from responsibilities of leading other people because of the nature of the politics that we are having, and also how hostility sometimes it can be. So you find that the young people that would have needed in those positions are not able to get into those positions because of the fear, because of the not them taking up the step of that responsibility, but how do we encourage them further? But that encouragement as well comes from the role models like you. Engage in politics. Start influencing decisions. When you start influencing certain decisions like these ones, they're going to help us also back at our home to make sure that we have progressive policies in different ways. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Humphrey. Brigham, would you like to touch upon? Oh, pardon me. Go ahead.
Sure. I'd love to touch upon the first question in regards to sexual and reproductive health and rights in crisis and emergency and humanitarian settings. I think there's some really interesting work that is being done here. I'd like to shout out the Feminist Humanitarian Network, which is a coalition of grassroots and international feminist organizations that look at what a feminist approach to responding to crisis looks like. And then there's also, and I know there's many of my colleagues in the room right now who work on this, the IWAG, which has something called the MISP. So it's the minimum initial service package. Like what ideally within the first 48 hours of an emergency, what should be implemented in regards to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we've been engaged in some advocacy efforts to ensure that the MISP is implemented at the onset of emergency. And I'll tell you one story, which is one time I remember calling one of the agencies of the U.S. government that does humanitarian response. And I called within a couple days of an emergency and I said, I am calling to check in about the implementation of the MISP. First of all, making a phone call was just so wild. Everyone's sending emails and sending letters. And suddenly it was like, why don't we call people like we used to? And in this phone call, I said, what's going on with the implementation of the MISP? The MISP says that there should be lubricated male condoms available, female condoms available, post-exposure prophylactics available for folks who are survivors of gender-based violence. And the person on the phone said to me, we are just trying to get water. How can we be thinking about this? The truth of the matter is they should support the MISP, and it is our job to hold this government and other governments accountable to ensuring that sexual and reproductive health services are available at the onset of an emergency. This is not a problem for later. This is an issue to be dealt with immediately in every emergency. And I'll pause there.
Great, thank you. If you all have time, we'll try to go to 11:05 if that's okay. So are there any questions in the back?
We have time for one
more. Oh.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Shirk from FP 2030, and thank you all so much. This has been a really great discussion. It's always great to see Sarah at a podium. I love doing that. So I'm going to actually, jumping from Sarah's comments, I want to hear from you all. I mean, gender equality does have a lot of important bipartisan elements. We talked about peace and security and humanitarian response. So I guess my question is really to you, Bridget, and to the Institute. How do we take this important report, which makes these connections, and get it beyond the pro-choice caucus? We talked about the important cross-sectional partners that came together with the blueprint, but even beyond that, we know there's a whole humanitarian network out there that isn't engaged in the blueprint and in feminist foreign policy. So I would love to hear about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought I was off from the questions. I'm not so prepared, but I will say thank you for the question. And I think it comes back to ensuring that we highlight how important SRHR is to bipartisan goals of gender equality and empowerment. Girls' education, it's a mutually reinforcing relationship between girls' education, access to education, and staying in school. But we also know that girls who are educated have more information about SRHR. And so highlighting those important connections is really important to bringing SRHR into the equation. It's often overlooked. It's easier to bypass conversations that are contentious. But we have to, once again, shift away from the siloed mindset and really bring up that power that SRHR has to advancing these goals. These goals cannot be achieved without SRHR. And I think there are plenty who hope that they can be. It would be easier to move past that, but we all of us, I'm sure, in this room and online know that that's just not possible. And so by including more people into the conversation of SRHR, inviting more people in, as we heard, that number, almost 300 years away from gender equality, it's just not acceptable. And so we need to gain more champions in this, and that means creating those dialogues with people who are working in girls' education, working in economic empowerment, working on issues regarding the Sustainable Development Goals, and bringing SRHR to the forefront and centering it. Thank you. Before we close up, I would really like to highlight all of the authors on the Connecting the Dots report. And again, if you don't have a copy, there is a hard copy outside. It's also online for your ease. But Maniza Habib up here speaking to all her work on this. Thank you so much, Maniza. Also, Veena Smith Ramakrishnan, who is in the audience too. Waving. Thank you. And also Joe Spidell, who I believe is online. So thank you all.
And I think with that, we will close our excellent event today. Thank you, Bridget, for your amazing moderation of today's event, to Sarah Craven for your excellent keynote address, and to Maniza for sharing the findings from the Connecting the Dots report. Thank you also to our amazing panelists, Humphrey, Caitlin, and Bergen, for a really enlightening discussion today. Thank you to our partners at the Population Institute for your partnership and support for today's event. And thank you to our Wilson Center events and AV teams for your technical support today. This event could not have happened without you. Finally, thank you to our audience for attending in person and tuning in online. The event recording will be available on the Wilson Center event page within 24 hours. We will also publish a summary of today's event on the .mom column of our blog, New Security Beat. You can also find the blog series that we published in partnership with the Population Institute launching the Connecting the Dots report on our blog and through one of the QR codes outside the auditorium. Thank you again for attending in person or tuning in virtually, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.